seen that happen before.
Yeah, it just started.
There you go.
Perfect.
Yeah, I just heard it.
It is recording now. Okay, so there you go. It is recording, and we'll be able to share the recording with people who are here and people who missed our session today. So as I was saying, welcome everyone. If you'd like to share with us where you're joining us from, that would be lovely to see where we are. And I think we can get started. I'm just going to repeat myself a little bit for the people who are not here. I am Adriana Consorte-McCrea. I am the chair of the IUCN SSC Conservation Translocation Specialist Group of the Human-Wildlife Interactions Working Group of the Conservation Translocations Specialist Group. And our session today is about conservation behavior change, how to change human behavior to help people and wildlife, and that will be led by Dr. Laura Perry. So before I introduce Laura and we get started, I'm just going to give a quick introduction about our group. Laura, if I could have a look at the next slide, please. So we have been working together since 2018, and our focus within the Conservation Translocation Specialist Group is to promote discussions of key issues in human dimensions of conservation translocations, to aid practitioners in finding a solution based on their experience and in expert advice. Hence, the talks we promote are as much information as opportunities for everyone to share their experiences and the problems they're facing, help develop networks and collaborations, and provide advice to projects on all stages of the development. So we also aim to support and inform the IUCN Conservation Translocation Guidelines and to share related resources with the wider conservation translocation community. For that, we have published a paper on that's basically guidelines to facilitate human-wildlife interactions and conservation translocations. And we are working at the moment on a longer version and a short guide, which will be companions to the IUCN Conservation Translocation Guidelines. They hopefully will be available by the end of the year. And every talk that we promote contributes content to the guidance that we are writing. So that's what we have been doing for all these years. I've shared the link to our website where you can find information about the group, information about events, and also recordings from previous events, publications. And it's an opportunity to get in touch with other people if you want to receive our messages and recordings, and if you want to be part of a group, just get in touch, send me an email or leave your details with us. So I think that's it about the group. I met Laura quite some time ago. I think it was 2013, Laura, wasn't it? And Laura was doing her PhD with the Wild Crew in Oxford. And it's fantastic to see her trajectory. And she specializes in an area that is very close to my heart and my interests. So Laura has been working with human dimensions of wildlife and focusing on conservation behavior change. When we talk, every time that we have an event with our group, we are addressing different aspects of human dimensions of conservation in general, but with specific application to translocations. And behavior is always something that is there, and we think, oh, it would be good to be able to address behavior, but something very specific. The knowledge involved comes from social sciences and social psychology. So I understand why the talk today has attracted so much attention, and we're very, very lucky to have Laura here with us today. Laura is a founding member of the IUCN SSC CEC Behavior Change Task Force, and has been previously Behavior Change Coordinator for the IUCN SSC. So with great pleasure and admiration, I will introduce you, Laura Perry.
Hi, everybody. Adriana, thank you so much for inviting me today. I'm really looking forward to speaking to everybody. So let me see about stopping this presentation. Okay, stop that one. Let's escape. Then we go to this one. Okay, tech check. How is that?
While you're sorting that out, Laura, I'll just remind people to keep their microphones turned off. Laura will have about 30 minutes, let's say, to talk, and then Laura's talk will be followed by a Q&A session where people can either raise their hands to ask questions or write their questions on the chat, and whatever you prefer. And there will be opportunity for people to then talk about their own experiences so that we can discuss the topics of the talk, okay? So I'll mute myself now.
Before you do that, can you see presenter view or can you see the slides properly? No, it's all good. Perfect.
It's good, yeah.
Okay, great. So, hi everybody. Really looking forward to talking to you about behavior change. But before I get into the details of that, the first thing I wanted to do is introduce myself. So I think, like a lot of biologists working in human dimensions, I was initially interested in human-wildlife conflict, large predators, Africa, hence my PhD at WildCREW. But through all of that experience to people doing what we might think of as more traditional conservation science, I got a little bit of background in how biologists are really good at designing mitigation, but quite often where that falls down is people actually taking that mitigation and applying it. So my PhD focused on livestock management behavior in East Africa, but instead of focusing on can we design another piece of mitigation or how does this prevent predators from killing livestock animals, my PhD focused on how we can use behavior change to think about what motivates people to do the mitigation that we have in mind. So what might make people bring animals into a kraal at night? What might encourage them to send a herder out with animals during the day? So instead of thinking of human behavior as a bit of a black box, actually working that into our conservation practice to think about how we can respond to that and integrate it into what we do. I then did a postdoc in Mozambique where I ran the community program and conservation program for a section of Nyasa Special Reserve. And following that, I was the behavior change coordinator for the Global Center for Species Survival based at Indianapolis Zoo. So another good piece of conservation alphabet soup. But in that role, I was responsible for working with about 170 specialist groups to help support them to integrate behavior change into their work. And that kind of veered from look at this survey and tell us how we might improve it through to what would a behavior change intervention look like for a specific question in a specific location. So it was a very varied role, but particularly my interests lie in that application of behavior change and how it can be used to genuinely achieve conservation success. So now, following that role, I work for myself effectively at Castle Rock Conservation, and I focus on behavior change. So supporting local NGOs in particular to design and implement appropriate behavior change interventions and everything that goes along with that. So as you'll see in this talk, that's not just behavior change, that's strategic planning, that's monitoring and evaluation, that's all those social science, human dimension components that need to fit together in order to make behavior change work. But that's what I focus on. And as I'll say through the talk, behavior change is a specialist discipline. I can't give you a 30-minute summary of how to do it, But I would love to hear about your projects either in the discussion afterwards, or please do reach out to me. I'm very interested in being collaborative and helping support projects where I can. So these are some, I will mention the Behaviour Change Task Force right from the start before I forget to do that. So this is your other key resource. And again, I'll return to this later, but I think it was late 2023, the IUCN SSC CEC Behaviour Change Task Force came together. So this is much like Conservation Translocation Specialist Group. It's a resource, right, for helping to support practitioners. And there's a couple of pieces of work that'll be relevant that I'll mention later. But just so everybody knows that this exists, it's out there, and as time goes on, it will hopefully become an even more useful resource for conservation practitioners. So this is the slide I was thinking I was on, where these are my current partners. And this is actually out of date now. There's a couple more countries to be added in there. But just to demonstrate that there's a lot of people out there who are thinking about behavior change. There's a lot of people who don't really know where to start, but are working to integrate it into their conservation practice. So I've got partners in a lot of different places, but I'm always interested in exploring more opportunities. So just to preface this, I realize that you are on this call, therefore you are already interested in behavior change and sort of have a sense of how it might be relevant to you. But that's not the case for all conservation practitioners. So I just think it's useful to highlight right at the start that basically most of today's conservation challenges relate to people. Whether you're looking at something like deforestation or plastic overconsumption, pollution in waterways, or whether you're looking at illegal wildlife trade, unsustainable use of wildlife. I think it's quite obvious how those things are related to human behavior. And I would add to that because most of us come from a biological sciences background, the problems that we find hardest to solve quite often are those human problems. So they're an area that a lot of us could grow in and figure out how to apply these social science tools more effectively. So the Behaviour Change Task Force recently, last year, did an annual review which scoped out how behavior change is relevant to conservation. And that's a really good resource that if you're interested, I would encourage you to have a read of that manuscript. But effectively, we were able to see how, if you look at the IUCN threat classification scheme, behavior change is relevant, has been relevant. There are notable examples of how behavior change can be used to think about all of those key threats about which we're most concerned. So behavior change is relevant to just about everything that we do. And just to pull that in a little bit, because I think it's easy to see the big picture, but sometimes it's hard to see how behavior change can be relevant for an individual conservation project or NGO. I just wanted to pull out some examples of what this actually means for real world organizations. So this is one of my partner organizations, Madagascar Fauna and Flora Group. It's a great organization. It's been working in Madagascar for, I think, about 40 years. And as many of you will know, a lot of the issues in Madagascar are very, very much to do with people. So you've got invasive species that are spreading very aggressively through a lot of the island. You've got unsustainable use of habitat or tarvi, where timber is cut and then burned for rice paddies. But you also have unsustainable consumption of wild meat. So this, way back when I started to get involved with MFG, this was one of the headline issues. How can we encourage people not to eat lemurs? And actually, the longer we've worked together, we've talked to communities, we've tried to figure out what's causing this. And it's quite apparent that people don't really want to eat lemur. It's difficult to catch, it can be expensive. They know that there are serious legal repercussions for being caught with lemurs. So this is not a desirable meat source. People prefer to eat chickens. But as in much of East Africa, chickens in Madagascar get Newcastle's disease. And Newcastle's disease vaccinations are expensive. They require top-ups every 3 months. It's quite difficult for people in very impoverished, very rural, very low levels of education communities to understand why the vaccination is important. So we are currently implementing a program that focuses on messaging why the vaccinations are important and supporting people to get access to those vaccinations. So we're not doing a campaign about wild meat. We're not saying, wouldn't it be great if you ate chickens? We're creating the opportunity for people to eat chickens and encouraging them to do those things that make it easier to access chickens. So vaccinating their flocks, engaging in good livestock husbandry. So I think that's a very realistic example for a lot of people thinking about how to integrate behavior change into what you're doing. This is another example. So work that I do in southern Tanzania with a range of partners, including WCS and North Carolina Zoo. So here we have a big problem with livestock predation. And what people often do in response to livestock predation is they will put poison on a carcass. The desired effect being to kill the predator, but what often ends up happening is this. So you kill huge numbers of vultures because they come in from, hundreds of miles around. You can have really serious mortality of events for vultures every time there's a poisoned carcass. And we would like people to stop poisoning carcasses. That'd be great. But having explored the concerns that these communities have and why they're doing the poisoning behavior, we chose not to focus on. So you can encourage people to look after their livestock better, and that's one great component of reducing poisoning behavior. If the livestock isn't killed, then there's no need to use poison. But the other aspect of this is dissuading people from using poison itself. And in communities where wildlife is quite often a problem, centering the messaging around livestock, around wildlife, and saying, wouldn't it be good for the wildlife to not use poison, is just not a realistic way to go or to get people to change their behavior. A much more realistic way is to say, this is your community, these are your dogs, these are your children. You do not want pesticides in and around your home. So here we're using a human health message to try and discourage use of pesticides, because that's something that makes a lot more sense to people. That's much more tangible for people in those communities. So I think behavior change can sometimes seem quite academic, and a lot of the publications seem very ivory towers. And it can sometimes seem like it's not applicable to your conservation project. In my experience, that isn't the case. And most conservationists could do more to kind of understand and focus on changing human behavior as part of their conservation activities. So with all that in mind, and hopefully I've convinced you that behavior change is useful, but with all that in mind, what exactly am I talking about? What do I mean by behavior change? So there's an extent to which this depends who you ask, right? Everybody has subtly different definitions of what is or isn't behavior change. But I think that there are 5 key components to what behavior change really means. So as far as I have experienced it, and how I think about behavior change, these are the 5 things you want to think about. So behavior change should start with a theoretical framework. It should not just be pulled from thin air. It should have some solid theoretical underpinning. That theoretical underpinning should probably relate to a number of key constructs that we know inform behavior. And I will go through all of these in order after we've done the summary. Your theory should then inform your theory of change. Behavior change should be part of a big picture conservation plan. It should not be something that happens in abstract, to actually result in tangible changes to human behavior, which are also measurable, right? We should be able to look at those changes, understand what our intervention has done. Has it succeeded? Has it failed? Or is it somewhere in between? I think that these 5 components, if you put these together, to me, that's behavior change. So, theoretical framework. So the first thing I would flag is that behavior change is very technical. And with biological background, you wouldn't go out and do a massive long-term predator-prey interaction study without a theoretical framework for understanding that ecological interaction. You wouldn't go out and do an animal behavior study without first going through the literature, understanding what similar species do, what frameworks that might be useful to think about those interactions. So I think that it's useful to apply the same logic to behavior change. And you see quite a lot of organizations doing behavior change without a cohesive vision of how those bits fit together. And I would really strongly advise against that. I think having a framework is quite important, right? We shouldn't just be doing stuff and hoping that it gets to the outcome that we want. There should be a reason that all these things are tied together. So with that in mind, there are an overwhelming number of different frameworks for behavior. And behavior change literature often draws from human health interventions. It draws from a lot of very applied intervention science. So there are very, very many frameworks, but I think that these are two of the most useful. So the theory of planned behavior is commonly used, as is COM-B. And basically, these models have similar terms where it's basically saying that a small number of constructs leads to the behavior. And by influencing or changing each of those constructs, we hope to be able to change the behavior itself. So here you'll see things like attitude, motivation, social norms. Those are all pretty standard things to consider as part of a behavior change model. Definitely, lots of different models are available, and different models will have different constructs incorporated into them. And again, I think it's quite overwhelming to get too into the weeds about different constructs, different models. So I would just think of these as Lego pieces, right? These are the building blocks with which your model is built. So things that we might commonly think about include, as I said, social norms, knowledge and beliefs, motivation, but it also might include extrinsic factors. So culture, socioeconomic factors, all those different things that we can reasonably expect to influence people's behavior in a given situation. With that in mind, we still need to build the behavior change into a plan. And I know that lots of you will have a background in conservation planning or spend a lot of time on that yourselves. So I would love to reinforce that and say plans really make all the difference. I think you have to think about why it is that you want to change a particular behavior. Understanding what behavior exactly you want to target. So I do see situations where people think they want to change one thing, but when you get down and think about the impact pathways, you can see that actually the behavior they want it to change is not the behavior they really need to change to see the outcomes they have in mind. And then that kind of, how does changing X behavior help you to achieve a conservation goal? So thinking about theories of change, connecting every behavior change intervention, every thought about behavior change into that big picture, how does it help us to achieve our conservation goals, is something that I think is really, really important. And yeah, it fits within a strategic plan. It should never happen in abstract. It should be embedded within whatever you're trying to do. And that actually plays into a common criticism. You'll see conservationists say, all the social science is great, but it's not clear to me how it actually supports my goals. And this is where it comes back to the planning. It should be really obvious. If you've planned sufficiently, it will be obvious how behavior change actually helps you achieve the things that you're trying to do, whether that is save a certain species, protect a habitat, decrease a certain behavior. It should all fit together. It shouldn't feel like you are doing something that doesn't help support conservation. There are an awful lot of behavior change techniques once you get into the weeds of, we want to change this behavior. There are suddenly dozens and dozens of different techniques you might apply. They're drawn from social marketing, from health interventions. There's a huge literature on this. And I think that is kind of a bit off-putting, right? The difference between X and Y can be very, very small. And if you don't have a huge amount of background in it, this can seem like quite an impenetrable literature. So there are a couple of resources that I always recommend as starting points. So there's the intervention mapping approach, which is Koch et al., which details really, really precisely the different types of intervention you might think of. And then there's the behavior change wheel, which is Michi et al. This is a great resource that shows you different types of interventions, how they might be useful in different contexts. And both of these tools boil down what is quite an overwhelming number of different options into something that is much more approachable. Although I will flag, this is not meant to be approachable unless you're a social scientist, right? In the same way that I simply would not go out and expect to do a population viability assessment. It's probably not my recommendation that you go out and design a behavior change campaign. And we'll come back to resources and tools that can help you to do that later. But this is a whole discipline. There's so much background that is required to understand how to do this. You don't need to do it on your own, but there are tools and resources that exist if you're interested in exploring it. And then the last thing that I think is necessary to qualify as a behavior change campaign is this measurability, right? Monitoring and evaluation is just such a critical part of all of the social science components of a plan. You have to know whether what you did succeeded. So evaluation might be something that you do at the end, and monitoring is something that you would do on an ongoing basis. And because behavior change is complex and people are very complex, it's particularly important to evaluate progress, because you could make things worse with a behavior change campaign that isn't designed thoughtfully. Or even if it is designed thoughtfully, it just might not work. So unlike many things, it's worth bearing in mind that what you do to focus on behavior change can genuinely be detrimental, and therefore it's important to monitor it as you go along, evaluate, make sure that you're having the impact that you think you're having before you do it for 10 years and realize it didn't do anything or made things worse. So those are kind of the component pieces of behavior change: theory, specific types of constructs, integrating it into a strategic plan, thinking about the behavior change interventions that we might want to use, and then monitoring and evaluation. But how does that all apply to individual pieces of work? So particularly for this group, I suspect that you actually already use some of the approaches that I might start with, right? I have certainly read the guidelines. I am familiar, at least to some extent, with how the recommendations say that you should approach conservation translocations. And there are a lot of overlaps between the tools we might use. So for example, audience segmentation, right? It's good practice to think about the different stakeholders that you have, their needs, their concerns in relation to a translocation. This is no different. It just takes it a step further to say, okay, well, what behaviors are they doing? What are their concerns, and how do we motivate them to do something differently? So it's just an extension of already thinking about the different groups within your audience. Similarly, there's a huge amount of outreach and engagement, talking to people, talking to communities to understand what they want to see as part of a translocation, what they don't want to see. Again, this just takes it a step further to think about the behavioral ramifications of a particular activity. So there are specific areas where I think behavior change, or specific questions where behavior change can be useful for thinking about conservation translocations and the human or wildlife interaction working group. But there are probably a lot of scenarios I haven't thought of where it's particularly relevant. And I would really, really like to have a discussion about that afterwards or at a follow-up date. But here are 3 that really occurred to me as I was thinking about this, planning this presentation. So there might be specific behaviors that you need to see change in before a reintroduction is to take place. So for example, livestock husbandry practices often change if a predator is no longer present in an area. And you might need to do some groundwork to ensure that those practices can change back to what they would have been 100 years ago once that predator is reintroduced. Similarly, human safety behaviors, right? They might change an awful lot if a predator is no longer on a landscape. And what you don't really want to do is throw the predator back out, people don't change their behavior, and then you have a really serious human wildlife conflict issue from the outset. So thinking about behaviors which might need to change alongside or in advance of a reintroduction is something that might be particularly relevant. And therefore you're thinking about the planning process, you're thinking about the long-term nature of these changes, because behavior change takes quite a lot of time and effort. The second consideration is that you might need to create certain conditions in order for a translocation to be applicable or suitable, right? So you don't want to reintroduce an animal to an area if it's just going to get hunted out immediately. You need to be confident that particular behaviors will not take place once you put the animal back in that habitat. Similarly, the same might apply for habitat loss, right? Or so going back to that Madagascar example, where you see tarvey and cutting of primary forest for rice paddies. To do a reintroduction in a particular area, you need to be quite confident that that area is going to be safe. So any incursions, any risk of losing that habitat further is incompatible with the translocation. So making sure that you have confidence that those behaviors will not continue or exacerbate a situation is probably quite key. And then I think an awful lot of the conservation translocations seem to be successful when they're well thought out. And I imagine that most of you would agree with that planning is what makes these things work. To change behavior is a long-term investment. It takes time, it costs money, it requires certain kinds of relationships with stakeholders. So being able to plan for that, to be realistic about budgets, realistic about what groundwork needs to go in to allow those things to happen, is probably a really important thing to get into the initial stages of a plan, to know what that work's going to look like. Because it's not useful to get 2 or 3 years down the process and then realize that you should have done something a year ago. So that's the other thing that I think is worth flagging, the long-term perspective on changing behavior and how it might figure into your conservation planning. So where do we go from here? I realize I have not given you a guide to how to change behavior, but I had half an hour for this talk, so ask me afterwards. But there are resources and tools that I do want to recommend. So you don't go away from this going, well, that was great, but I don't know what to do. So first port of call, I would really recommend this publication from the Behaviour Change Task Force. I think it really summarizes where we've been as a discipline and what we might learn from similar disciplines. So a lot of the examples in this actually come from environmental sciences or sustainability studies, simply because there is relatively little literature published from conservation focusing on behaviour change. Obviously, we hope that that will increase, but I think that this gives you a really good perspective on what is already out there and what we might hope to see going forwards. There's also a couple of resources. I showed a slide earlier with about 10 textbooks on it. You don't need to read all of them. These are 2 books that I think are genuinely quite good. The Healthcare Handbook in the red is very dense. So know that before you order it. The blue one is much more accessible. But if this is something that you are interested in, I think that these are 2 really good resources that you might start to explore how people have done behavior change in the past or what social marketing might mean for a behavior change intervention. There's also training resources. So I think Traffic's resources in this sphere are really good. They've got an online course that I really recommend. I think it's a great starting point. I am also contemplating doing a course, a couple of days perhaps at some point this year on behavior change. So if you're at all interested in that, there's a link on my website to express interest and tell me what your geography is. So if you're interested in maybe a 3-day workshop to give an introduction to behavior change, please do fill out that form. That would be very useful to me. But if not, the Traffic resources are really very good. And then I really do think that a lot of this is about connecting with experts. These are a number of organizations that work in this space. There are others. Rare, obviously, has a long history of working on behavior change. The task force now exists. There are definitely other experts within this space who I think it would be a good idea to reach out to. So I think it's evident that we haven't made behavior change as accessible or clear as it should be. In the community of practitioners, I think the language is not accessible. I think we haven't communicated particularly well, and I think there's a lot of misunderstanding of what behavior change is or how people can start to use it in their work. But there are also those guides, resources, and people with expertise on this topic who are interested in helping. As I've said throughout the talk, I do think this is a very technical discipline. There's a huge amount of background where you look at the theories, you look at specific behavior change techniques, much as an ecologist wouldn't go out and learn, I don't know, the socioeconomic modeling, for example, right? It's not suitable necessarily for all conservation practitioners to learn these skills, because I wouldn't presume to go and learn your specific disciplines, because that would be a whole retraining and I'm just not going to do that. So I think people can feel like they ought to learn all of them. And I'm basically trying to reassure you that that's not suitable. Like, you don't need to go and learn this, right? In the same way that I wouldn't go and learn a whole other discipline. So don't worry, there are people to ask, and that's probably a better use of your time than trying to gain all this expertise in a thing that you might only use periodically. But I will say, as we started this conversation, I think behavior change is so relevant for so many of today's conservation problems. And even looking at my partners, I have partners from, North America through to Tanzania, through to Japan, clearly there are a lot of opportunities to use behaviour change to support conservation practice, and I hope that we will see more of that in the future. So please do get in touch if, following this conversation, there are more questions that you still need answered, or you would like to explore what behaviour change looks like for your project. I would love to hear from people. So yeah, that's a very brief summary, and I look forward to the discussion.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Laura. It was like a condensed version, but I think very, very informative and gave us a good taste of what's involved and the need for interdisciplinary collaboration when we're talking about the biological side and the social dimensions and psychological dimensions of conservation, isn't it, in general? Of course, behavior change is something very specific, but we come across other areas of human dimensions that are important, are relevant for conservation translocation and for conservation in general. And people get very scared just for the overwhelming sensation that it's too much, I don't know what to do. But as you said, isn't it, they're professionals who want to collaborate and to share the load. I want to introduce some of our colleagues from our Human-Wildlife Interactions Working Group here. Filippo Marino is the co-chair. Filippo will be taking questions and trying to capture what people are commenting and to share. And I know we've got Faye and we've got Kirsty and we've got Subir here as well. Maybe we've got some more. So some of us are here hiding, populating the space. I'd like to thank our audience for being here and open the floor for questions. Okay, so please raise your hand or write. I know that we've got comments and people talked about their background, which is fantastic. So I'll pass on to Filippo.
Thanks, Adriana. So yeah, just to reiterate what Adriana just said, thanks, Laura, for the great talk. You've given us, invaluable information on, theoretical and practical information on how we can address and integrate behavioral change in our conservation projects. And we already have quite a few questions. Today, the attendance was quite good. We have more than 100 participants. So once again, you can raise your hands and you can also use the chat function to ask questions to Laura. And I can start with one from Amy. She's asking if you can we see the citation again, please?
Oh,
I don't know which
citation.
One.
Yeah.
Maybe Amy, you can unmute
suggested
yourself.
That I just make the presentation accessible. I think the video component goes along with the meeting recording, right? So people should be able to see the presentation.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry I didn't say that, but the follow-up from the session today is sharing the presentation, sharing any associated resources that Laura may have, her papers, her website, and we can add the references that you used as well. Okay, so we can do that. If you're not in our mailing list, you might want to leave your email address or send it to me. But it's something that can be done.
Yeah, we have another one from Aidan. Excellent talk, Laura. Thank you. Do you work with the IUCN SSC Human-Wildlife Conflict and Coexistence Group? I presume so.
Well, not at present. So I talked to Alex. I'm very interested in the Human-Wildlife Conflict Coexistence Task Force specialist group now, isn't it? So I talked to them. I'm not a member of that group. I think there is an awful lot of overlap, so I would like to do more stuff with them, but it's limitations of everybody being extremely busy. So hopefully more in the future.
Thanks, Laura. There were a couple of raised hands, but I can't see those anymore. Perhaps there were a couple of people, I'm quite sure of it, but I can't see them anymore. Okay, yeah, Andrea Klassen.
Thank you for the great presentation, Laura. I'm curious about funding sources for work on human behavior change. It just seems like with your examples, there were great examples of ways to maybe more easily shift human behavior, but they're a bit of a stretch from kind of traditional wildlife focused work. And I'm just wondering if it would be more difficult, and maybe some doors have been closed to try to get funding for more traditional wildlife and conservation groups. But I wonder if maybe some doors might be open in terms of getting funding for human health, or animal husbandry campaigns and other types of funding.
It's a great question. I think you raise a really good point. I would say that longer term, a lot of the big funding agencies have really not understood properly how behavior change factors into conservation. However, if you look at things like UK government family of grants, so things like Darwin and the illegal wildlife trade grant, they're starting to really think about behavior change. So particularly with the illegal wildlife trade, you can really see that that's a big part of what they're looking for. So I would say that you're right, longer term or looking backwards, but hopefully this is an indicator that things are starting to change, and conservation funding is really realizing that behavior change is needed to secure some of these conservation goals long term. But I also do think that there's probably opportunities for things like One Health or incorporating the kind of community components of this more deeply and seeking funding from other sources. I don't know what that would look like, but yes, we ought to explore that further, because it's definitely a win-win, I think, for a lot of human health outcomes and conservation outcomes.
Great, thanks, Laura. We have another one in the chat from Morgan Hart, and he's asking if the behavior changes you are hoping for are complex and surround a single species. Do you recommend taking each behavior separately or tackling it all together?
And that's a good question. So I take you back to the audience segmentation component, right? So thinking about who is doing different behaviors, and that's the first question you would need to answer that bigger question, right? It might be the case that you have different groups who are participating in different behaviors, in which case it's much more appropriate to think about those audiences separately and what's appropriate for them. If those audiences are the same, and it's two different behaviors or a handful of different behaviors the same group are doing, then yes, it might be appropriate to think about it holistically as part of a single bigger campaign. But yeah, I would come back to that question of who it is that you're looking at and go from there.
Great, thanks. There's also a comment from James, and as James has just done, I invite everyone to use the chat also for an open conversation and discussion with Laura about the pivotal aspects of behavioral change in translocations. And so Laura, feel free to check and reply when you have time, even after, in the last few minutes. But there's another question. Thanks, Laura. May I ask, what are the common difficulties to handle human-wildlife conflicts across different regions in the world?
Yeah, so, and just since you raised James's comment, I completely agree, right? Communities really need to be centered in this process, and I would encourage people to read James's comment. I totally agree with him. I had a 30-minute presentation. I absolutely think that co-designing things with communities is a key part of that, and maybe that's something to explore at another date. But yes, definitely behavior change done in collaboration is really important, and that also answers some of the questions about whether you should be changing behavior, because where communities want behavior change too, that's a win-win for everyone. In terms of human-wildlife conflict, I think that something that you often see is it's not really human-wildlife conflict, it's often human-human conflict. So you've got different stakeholder groups that have a disagreement about how a resource is meant to be used or how a strategy is meant to be approached. And I think recognizing that can be a key component of figuring out a way forward. So I think it shouldn't be unusual to see building relationships with other stakeholders as part of a strategy, right? Where you need to actively go out and engage with a particular group. So I would say more than anything, I think that that's a key difficulty in resolving human-wildlife conflict around the world, is encouraging everyone to feel like repairing those relationships is a key part of their action plan and not just something that they do to get to somewhere else. So changing the behavior of the organization that you're working with, often the conservation organization, is not part of this in some situations.
And there's another one from Lucia. Hi, Laura. Thanks for your presentation. I'm curious about practical ways. One second. Yeah. I'm curious about practical ways to measure progress and impact in behavior change campaigns on human-wildlife coexistence and conflict. Are there any specific online resources that you would recommend?
So monitoring and evaluation, I can't think of any right now, but I'll think about that and see if there's anything I can send over. But as I said in the talk, I think monitoring and evaluation is something that often trips people up because it can seem like you need to spend a huge amount of your budget and a huge amount of effort on M&E, and then conservationists often go, well, I'd rather do the intervention, I'd rather save the animals, and they don't spend the time on it. But there are definitely resources that you can use to support that M&E, and it should be streamlined. It should fit with the program that you're trying to do, right? There's no sense having 50% of your budget on M&E. So I'm really supportive of people exploring what that looks like. It could be qualitative, it could be quantitative, it could be a mix of different things. So people shouldn't feel burdened by their M&E. It should be an opportunity to show what good work they've done. And I'd be happy to talk to people about M&E specifically if that's a barrier. There's lots of different ways you can approach it. I can't think of any resources right now, but sometimes you want to measure behavior. Sometimes you want to measure changes in perceptions or values. Sometimes you want, well, always it would be ideal to measure lots and lots of different pieces so you can add up those bits to a complete understanding of what's changed. But it's definitely a challenge to get appropriate M&E.
Yeah, 100%. And there's a similar question from Amy. Would love ideas on where to look to shape measuring the results of behavior change activities. So I think that everyone in regards to this topic can get in touch with Laura, I guess, even after the talk. So she might recommend useful references. And there's another one from Ricardo. Hello, thanks for the presentation. Sometimes, if not often, explicitly stating that we want to change people's behavior leads to immediate rejection of the idea by key stakeholders. Yet, lack of openness and transparency about it leads to accusations of hypocrisy. Do you have any ideas on how to deal with this?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Yeah, it's a great question. And I would say that goes back to James's comment that this should be done with communities. So in my experience, if you have a good working relationship with a stakeholder group, people are aware of what the problem is, right? And you might frame it in different ways. It might be that one community sees it as this is the problem and the conservation organization sees it from a slightly different angle. But fundamentally, everyone usually has an awareness of what that thing in the middle is, what the actual issue is. So I'm also a member of SULI now, Sustainable Use and Livelihoods Group. I spend a lot of time thinking about alternative livelihoods because behavior change needs to be a win for the people whose behavior is changing. And that comes back to the core of that question, which is we shouldn't be going in and trying to change people's behavior because they're doing a naughty thing. It should be something that they change their behavior, we get a great conservation outcome. They change their behavior, they get a good outcome. So when you frame it in that way and think about it like that, as this should be an opportunity to design something together which makes things better for both parties, then you run up against less of this, well, that stakeholder wants to do this to us, and less of the disagreement or the accusations of hiding things or being complicit in not very nice stuff. So it comes back to that co-design, I think, and making sure it's a good opportunity for everybody involved.
Yeah, and there's a question from Serge. And by the way, apologies everyone if my pronunciation is not perfect. And congratulations on your excellent presentation, Laura. What is the likelihood of local communities changing their behavior, and how can we be confident that the change is irreversible?
Long-term change is really, really hard. And what people want is to do a single intervention and then it be fixed forever. That's really, really, really hard. It's more realistic to assume that sustaining change is going to require effort. And I think that expecting to have long-term effort expended on sustaining that change is a good thing for conservation organizations to frame that as. So we're going to be involved. in the long term to make sure that this lasts. It might be the case that that's not necessary. You see some situations where a community really takes a change to heart and it becomes, they own it. That's the ideal situation. It's really owned by the community and self-perpetuates. But going in with the expectation that that would happen is, I think, very, very not likely, not so realistic. So assuming you're in for the long haul is a good framework to think about. And then the likelihood that a community changes behavior, that depends, right? It depends on the behavior. It depends on how well the program is designed. It depends on there being suitable alternatives. And I'm a believer in this, right? I think that there is always an alternative, but it might be the case that the alternative costs more money than is available, right? That's the realistic answer, that not all things are practicable. But I think there's usually a way forwards. There's usually a way to make things better if it's co-designed, if it benefits everybody, if everyone really recognizes that there's a challenge. So it depends on that investment. If you put a small amount of effort in, it probably won't work because this is something long-term, sustained, that needs to be done thoughtfully. So your likelihood of putting a small amount of effort in and getting a really great result is, I think, pretty slim. But I would say that that goes for most things in conservation. It's not unlike anything else. So the more you invest in it, I think the more likely it is to succeed.
Thanks, Laura. And once again, I invite everyone to, to unmute themselves and to engage with a conversation with Laura. But we have another question from Avantika. Non-conservation compliance behavior is often criminalized and sometimes impossible to observe and study. Can you suggest anything to overcome this challenge?
Yeah, that is definitely a challenge. And it's interesting to me how willingness to talk about illegal behavior varies so much, right? You can have communities who are perfectly happy to tell you about an illegal thing they did last weekend. And you can also have communities that won't talk about anybody in the community ever having done anything illegal in their lives, right? So there's a huge amount of variation there, which I think is really interesting and probably comes back to, such social, cultural histories lasting 300 years or 1,000 years. So I think that's fascinating. It definitely makes it hard to track changes in behavior. There are various indirect techniques that you can use to measure things. So people will be familiar with bean counts or randomized responses or other different survey techniques to get at illicit information. In my experience, qualitative approaches, where there is trust, can also be really useful. So those statistical techniques that I think people often think of when you think of sensitive topics actually just don't always work. Sometimes it just doesn't make sense. Sometimes people don't get them. For whatever reason, it doesn't work. I think where you have trust with a community and they know that you're not going to pass information across to law enforcement, you can often get some really interesting data in interviews where people just give you a little bit of background or say, I didn't personally do this, but my neighbor maybe one time did X. So and because interviews, where they're semi-structured, can feel more natural, it can feel like a conversation that you might have with a friend or a person that you know, I think that's often an interesting way to get information. But yes, where things have really serious repercussions, it's difficult to measure behavior. So you might want to explore proxies in that situation, right? You might want to look at whether you can take direct biological measurements and then look at what you can get that isn't perfect, but does somehow indicate changes in behavior. So you might, for example, look at the acceptability of a particular behavior across the community. It doesn't tell you how much that behavior has changed, but it's a reasonable assumption to think that if everyone started out thinking a behavior was really fine, not a big deal, and in 5 years, everyone thinks it's completely unacceptable, that it's not socially appropriate to do it, it's reasonable to expect that that reflects genuine changes in perhaps the frequency or certainly the social norms surrounding that behavior.
Thanks, Laura. There's a comment and a question from Esteban, which is quite long. So maybe if you can use the chat maybe to go through it, but it's about project sustainability or over time.
Where am I looking? Let's see if I can find it.
It's towards the end. It's
okay. Yes, got it. Okay. Colombia. Okay. Human-jaguar interactions. Interesting. Yeah, I think this is my experience in Madagascar as well. Just the logistics of some places make behavior change so much harder. Yep, I'm familiar with Silvio's work, where for everybody who's not in the chat, changing children and engaging with children changed their parents' behavior. What can we do to make our projects sustainable through time? Yeah, so that's the question about long-term impact again. But I do think that targeting influencers is a really important thing, and not influencers in the sense of Instagram or YouTube, but community influencers. So my PhD showed that community influencers have a really big impact on how people want to manage their livestock. So if the community leader does something, everyone else wants to do it. Or if somebody who is well respected locally adopts a particular behavior, that's much more compelling for everyone else. So I personally really like using norms. I really, really like using those interpersonal relationships to promote particular behaviors. So that's something I would definitely explore. And every case will be different, right? If you think about the example of children influencing their parents, sometimes that might be the most appropriate strategy, or elsewhere it might be the older women, or elsewhere it might be people with really good jobs, right? And it will depend on the community and your knowledge of that community, who you want to target. But that goes back to that foundational piece for any behavior change, which is really understanding your audiences, the different groups within it, their concerns, their drivers, all of that basic community understanding really helps to inform the intervention design. And knowing who should be a target for a campaign or who you really need to work with is great. Really good start.
We have a question from Benny. She's from Indonesia. And as technology advances, many methods are used to drive behavioral change. What is your response to behavior change driven by technology, such as social media, in cases like illegal wildlife trade?
Yes, I am not an expert in online messaging. So there are people who have far, far, far more expertise in that than I do. I am much more used to working in situ with particular groups. That said, I think that social media and advertising online can be really powerful ways of reaching particular groups, right? If they're a really online audience, that's a really great way to think about engaging with those audiences. And some of the work that I'm doing, we are using online campaigns to target specific groups. So I think like anything, it's a tool, right? Thinking about who you reach best or most effectively with different approaches is how I would want to do this. And that might sometimes be an online conversation.
There's another one from Caroline. Hello, Laura. Thank you for your presentation. In developing countries, I have noticed that as a way of raising money, government stakeholders have put more priority in conservation of wildlife compared to human life. This causes negative attitude from local communities towards wildlife. What can be done in such cases?
That's really hard. Yeah, that does. My experience has been that often working with wildlife authorities is one of the trickiest stakeholders because there is such a reluctance to build communities into wildlife policy in some places. Obviously, that doesn't go for anywhere, but it seems like that's the experience of many people. My perception of this is that you're in a really good situation if a community sees you as an ally. If the wildlife authority sees you as a conservation NGO, but the community sees you as advocating for what they need, I think that is a space that can be uncomfortable, but is often a really good place to be in as a conservation NGO. It helps smooth over some of the difficulties that those different stakeholder groups have. So I don't think that I have any short or succinct tips for how to do that, but only that we're in a good position to act as an intermediary to maybe smooth over some of those rough edges, because this is a habitual problem. It's definitely something that many countries experience, and we could be good at supporting communities and wildlife authorities to get what they want.
Okay, so we have one last question in the chat, and it's about...
Sorry, Filippo.
Okay.
I can't find the little hand to raise. So
Okay.
I've got a question that relates to that.
Go ahead.
I don't know where it is. I know there are many people here who are practitioners and have been facing this kind of issues. It would be nice to hear, your experiences as well, and you can, of course, unmute yourself and discuss. I was going to bring together, Laura, the issue of respect, because the way you placed the behavior research is very respectful, and I think that's so admirable. And I think that it's a different direction in conservation, let's say, in general, yeah, but much more in tune with communities and with context, and with building long-term relationships that can actually be beneficial to everyone. And the idea of listening and working with the community. Can you tell us a bit about this movement in this direction, and how it is to work with conservation biologists who want the change, but may not have this understanding of the long term and the context and so on, please?
That's a really interesting question. I think it's quite interesting to watch people with a really proper biological sciences, biological conservation background move into this space. So I would say 10 years ago, right, there was a lot more reluctance to take this type of approach. And I don't think that that's the case now. I think I would say most practitioners recognize that it is important. This was the case when I was with the SSC, that specialist groups knew it mattered, knew that they ought to do something in this space, but didn't really know how to reconcile it with what they'd already been doing. So I think the change that we're seeing is great. And I think that people are realizing that it's a long-term process. So it may not be that all conservation organizations are at the place to have that long-term view of community relationships and valuing all of that. But the more good examples those conservationists see, the more willing they will be to adopt those approaches going forwards. So I think we're kind of in a phase now where the people who are doing behavior change, the ones who are really interested, the early adopters still, it's people who are engaged, who want to do things right, who are trying their best to kind of learn and adapt and treat things differently than they might have previously. But over time, I would hope that this becomes more mainstream and everybody knows what is required to do this well or how to get support with it. So I think the tides are moving in a good direction. I'm seeing this far more commonly discussed, and hopefully that will continue.
That's excellent to hear. And I am actually a conservation biologist. I'm not a social scientist, so that people know. Filippo, do you want to, I think there is, yeah.
There's one last question in the chat, and then I have a couple of questions myself for you, Laura. Apologies. And so, is there any tips or references to prepare survey questions pre and post change of behavior program, for example, to reduce the demand of wildlife products?
Yes. So, tips. You need to think about what's going to change. So you'll often see people who have an education component to their work, and then they have a pre-post survey. But actually, there's often a little bit of misalignment between what's in the survey and what's in the educational content. So you need to make sure that those things really neatly line up, or it's going to look like you didn't have the impact you think you're going to have. So really understanding how you expect what you're messaging to hit and what you want people to take away from that is key. So any education or outreach thing, I would boil it down. I think, what do we want people to take away from this? What do we have that supports those goals? Okay, then that's the thing that we're measuring. So making sure they tightly align is the first thing. I often see people with different questions in a pre and post, which sounds like an odd thing to say, but I do see it often enough that it's worth noting. If you're looking for a change, you want to use the same instrument, or 95% the same instrument, so you can actually document the difference. And then there's one other thing that I was going to say. What was it? Oh, it's gone. I can't remember. There was one other point. If it comes back to me, email me and I'll see if I can remember what that third point was later.
Yeah. So one of my questions for you was about what are the next steps for your research in the near future? So how you're bringing forward your research on behavioral change?
Yeah, so what I would really like to see is big projects. I've got with partners, I've got 2 big UK government grant applications in process. We will see if those come to anything, but what those big funding streams allow you to do is control groups. And I think that too often we don't incorporate those kind of scientific best practice approaches. And we say, okay, behavior has changed, but you don't know how much context has influenced that, or changing culture, or all these different factors. So bringing a really scientific framework to behavior change, because it's a science, it's a discipline. There are proper analytical processes to go through, and including control groups is really quite an important thing to do. So I would say that's something that I'm looking to going forwards. And I think what I really enjoy is working with partners who wouldn't have done this historically, who are on that learning curve, trying to do better going forwards. If you're already experienced in this, if you've already got a team member who has expertise, it's not the most useful use of everyone's time and money, right? If you know what you're doing, great. But I really like kind of holding organizations' hands so they start to figure out what this can mean for them, and designing tools and approaches that really work going forwards. So for me, I'm always interested in new partners, new opportunities to use this or get people on that ladder, because I think once they've started, then they can really see how much value this brings. And I've never had anyone go, we changed behavior there, but I don't think I'll bother in the future, right? It's always, oh, that's great, let's do more. So I'm excited to see a range of different organizations incorporate this. Yeah, that's hopefully something that's happening more and more.
Yeah, you actually kind of answered my following question, which was about how would you see, bringing forward the behavioral change at a sort of a disciplinary level, so a higher level rather than at the specific project level. So what are the main barriers, and how can we overcome these barriers to integrate behavioral change in conservation science?
Absolutely. I think the behaviour change task force is going to be key for that moving forward. So there's currently a needs assessment document that we've been working on for about a year, where we talk to an awful lot of practitioners across the CEC and the SSC to say, why are you not doing this? What would help you to do this? And I've actually just done a similar piece of work with one of my partners, that kind of scoping, understanding what has been done and what needs to be done for a particular taxonomic group looking forwards. So I think those needs assessments provide direction, and without giving away spoilers, the key things from the needs assessment are effectively people need training, people don't know where to go with it, people need access to resources, as in all things with conservation, and guidelines, right? Like the conservation translocations, people want guidelines, and guidelines alarm me a little bit, because there's an extent to which people can do a lot of harm with a little bit of knowledge. If you have just a small amount, you can make things worse. But having a resource out there that gives people a jumping off point to connect with experts to gain more knowledge is probably something that's really important going forwards. So I would expect the Behaviour Change Task Force to be producing guidelines over the next year or two, hopefully. So hopefully that should be a resource that's available in the not too distant future.
Yeah, fingers crossed. They will be out in the next couple of years. And there's one more question. Hello, Laura. Thank you for your presentation. What advice would you give to someone starting out in the field? Thank you. In this field. This field
specifically.
Yeah.
So I think that this is quite a small field still. And I think that it's a great time to be getting into behaviour change, because there's a relatively small community of practitioners. So I would connect with people. I think that whether you're a master's student, PhD student, or thinking about incorporating it into your work, I think that it's never a bad thing to know who else is working with this in this space. So, I'm always happy to chat to people, because it's useful to know who's working on what on the other side of the world if it's behaviour change related. So figure out whose research you like, figure out whose work you like, talk to them, connect with people. That I think gives you a good foundation for knowing what's out there. And also, as you move forwards and develop expertise within this, that makes sure that everybody is passing things in the right direction. Well, I don't know about that, but this person does, or vice versa.
Yeah. Thank you. I think we still have time for a couple of questions. And while we wait, if anyone is writing any more questions, we can, make some points about key messages about your talk. If there's anything that you want to highlight before we end the session.
I've got a follow-up question to ask. I know that some people had to leave at 5, and that's fine. I'm very happy that we've got lots of people here, and we've got some lovely questions. We've got Grace. Thank you for a wonderful session. Community-led conservation rooted in community-informed behavior change is key to addressing threats, meeting people's needs, and protecting species. This has been a very informative webinar, and I'm appreciative of your expertise and insights, which is, thank you very much, Grace. I think, Laura, you're talking about the danger of little knowledge, and seriously, isn't it? We see when we reviewing papers and stuff, people who arrive with questionnaires without any framework, and is this, I don't know what it is, and I don't know how to fix it, but of course collaboration and working with people, but it's the thing of knowing a little bit and wanting to do it yourself and actually not knowing
even
why
worse than that.
Yeah.
Even worse than surveys that are done without a theory behind them or a flow to them is I will see campaigns that reinforce the opposite message to what they're intending. So, for example, you'll see people write up information pieces which are basically saying, loads of people in this community do this bad thing. That's terrible. What that does is that reinforces that that's normal. Right? This is a perfectly fine thing to do. It doesn't matter if it's illegal because everybody else has done it. So you see messaging out there that is genuinely counterproductive. And that's where I think it's really dangerous, right? People know that they want to change behavior. They just message in a way that is not informed by a knowledge of this field. Or the other thing that people do is assume that we are normal. We're really weird. We have a really weird perspective on conservation, on biodiversity, on all of those things, thinking, well, I would respond this way to a piece of information. You can't generalize how you personally feel about it, how you would expect to respond to something, because we're such an unusual group, because we're experts in biology and conservation. So assuming that the way that you react to something is the way that other groups are going to react to it is also a really, really risky thing to do, because it's seldom the case.
Absolutely, isn't it? And we are very bad. Well, it's a thing that happens a lot, that we think we are right, and that's how things should be, and that's everyone should do the same. And but I think maybe the only way to address this gap is increasing knowledge about the field, isn't it? And I think is what Philippe was saying about mainstreaming education about the importance of attitudinal research and behavior change within conservation in general, and in biosciences and ecology as well. Incidentally, I think this is how I came into it, because I started working with animal behavior, conservation, and then you always coming across people and people issues. And I had good tutors that put me in a direction to reading about behavior. So I guess, yeah, you have to have an entry point, isn't it? To see that you're not alone, and it happens every time, but there are ways of doing it that have been studied, and it's a specialized field, as you're saying.
Yeah, I think that, for example, the guidelines and those kind of outputs would be really useful. My perception, I'm not an expert in the field, but my perception is that many conservationists sort of conflate addressing behavioral change with sort of using soft power to achieve what they really want to. And they're not really open to actually, taking in the results of the research, for example. And I don't know if it's something that you kind of you've seen in the field, because you're the expert here, but that's my sort of a perception as an outsider.
For sure. That's definitely the case. The biggest one I see is education. We're going to educate people and then they'll do things differently. No, I mean, there's so much research to indicate that changing what people know does not change their behavior at all. And I think because we're so scientifically minded as a discipline, like, well, if I knew that fact, I would do things differently. But, you know, that is not why people do things that they do. It's not because they didn't know something. So my biggest, not exactly bugbear, but the thing that if I could wave a magic wand and have all the people who are doing this think about it, it would be education and outreach programs, because they often don't have behavioral goals. They're not really aligned between what they're doing and the outcomes that they want to see. And they're often not monitored or evaluated in any sort of coherent and systematic way. So education and outreach has an awful lot of room for growth. And I think people are starting to do that, but that's the biggest kind of area for improvement as I see it across the discipline, is that just an awareness that educating people is not going to result in the change that you want to see.
Yeah. Go ahead, Adriana. Yeah.
Yeah, I can just keep talking here. You know how it is. I have so many questions. Actually, Laura, I have another question that I don't know. I have some people who said they are working with behavior and in different countries, and that's always an issue, isn't it? Because as an European person working in Africa, working in Asia, how do you make that work? You know, as someone who comes from a different culture, working with traditional communities and so on and so forth.
So I think you always have to assume you don't know anything, right? I think particularly it can actually be quite a useful thought experiment to work in the US, right? Because it's a culture that you think you know quite a lot about, but actually you don't, right? We are not typically hanging out with people who own ranches, for example, for most of us. So I think the humility to recognize that I can't really speak for any community. I'm an unusual conservationist because I've got a human dimensions background and I'm not a rancher. So I think actually just going in always with the lens that I don't know about the social conditions here and assuming that you have to have local partners to tell you about that is always a useful thing, even if it's a European country, because the needs of farmers in the Pyrenees versus people, groundskeepers on grouse moors up in Scotland, or ranchers who suffer from conflict with campers in the US. Even though they're European communities, I still don't know about them. And that's just as true for partners around the world, that you have to have those local partners to tell you about what's relevant in a particular place. So I always assume I don't know anything. And I think that's much easier.
That's fantastic. That's a great message, isn't it? And it's all about that, putting yourself in a place of respect that you've been doing from the beginning. We said we would give you time to bring together some thoughts, but we still have time for a few questions.
Just one more, I think. It's just arrived
okay.
in the chat, from Richard. Great talk. So it is more effective to tackle changes in the environment, not the behavior itself.
Yes, environmental restructuring can be really, really helpful. So creating conditions whereby people might automatically do a particular behavior rather than something else. That's great if you've got the ability to do it. So I think this is where you get into the land of what different behavior change approaches you take and how they fit together. So creating the conditions where, for example, plastic straws, right? Plastic straws no longer being president, and notwithstanding whatever Trump's decided to do today, right? But plastic straws not being available means people don't use plastic straws. So that's an example of changing the environment to get the behavior that you want to see. So where possible and where it doesn't really conflict with people's rights and people's needs, because that's the other danger that you run with changing the environment, that you could suddenly make living conditions much worse for people if you take away something that they need for whatever reason. But with that big caveat in mind, as long as it doesn't infringe upon people's rights, needs, concerns, then yes, environmental restructuring, changing the environment in which a behavior happens is a great thing to do. But in my experience, it's always useful to tie a couple of different behavior change approaches together. So as in so many things, a multifaceted approach is always more effective. So yes, definitely great tool when you can do it and when it's appropriate, but not the end of the world if you can't, and even better if you can do it with other things alongside.
Thanks, Laura. I think that we can wrap up the session. I don't know if you have any other key messages that you want to highlight before we close the session.
Yes, please do bring together some key messages. I think we had some interesting questions coming up from people's experience. Oh, I think there's another one.
Another one.
Ah, gosh, just a very big question.
That's a difficult one. Yeah.
Go on.
Environmental justice and behavior change. That's a huge question. I think it comes back to what Adriana has been saying about respect, right? Incorporating communities and their needs and what is just in a particular example. All of these things need to go together. And I think that is part of the conversation around environmental justice, right? It's recognizing that different communities who have historically been marginalized are really important in this dialogue, and that we really need to integrate them if we want environmental justice moving forwards. So I don't think I have anything new to say other than this is a partnership, right? It's like all behavior change. And let me just summarize, I suppose, that this is always better when it's done together. And that can go for designing things in partnership with communities. It can also be in partnership with different kinds of experts, right? Thinking about this as an interdisciplinary science, and that there are areas of expertise, people with expertise that you can call on for support. So I think the tide is moving in the direction of incorporating behavior change. You look at funders, you look at the courses that are available, you look at people's interest. People want more behavior change within conservation. There are lots of opportunities to do it, and do it with people who are not just conservationists or conservationists and something else. So I think there are lots of great directions this can go, particularly as you look at organizations like the Behavior Change Task Force. There's really a gathering momentum in this field. So the resources exist. I'm always happy to hear from people who are interested in this. This is just something to keep talking about, I think. Go away, think about it. How does it apply to you? Talk to people, and hopefully this ball will keep on rolling for more and better behavior change in the future.
Amazing. I think that we don't have any more questions. Do you have anything, Adriana, that you want to add?
That's it. I think it was a wonderful summary of the key ideas there, Laura, and what we need to be aware of, and how we can progress conservation and conservation translocation, thinking about behavior change, but from a perspective of social environmental justice as well. So very, very happy. And so I'd like to thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And
thank you for having me.
You're very welcome.
Thanks, Laura.
Maybe we'll have another talk in the future on any particular sub-area of that you'd like to explore. And obviously something that interests everyone. And thank you everyone for taking part. As I said, we'll be sharing the recording. I've got lots of new emails of people who would like to hear from us, which is great. And I've shared our website again for other resources. And we always accept suggestions of subject areas we would like to explore for future talks. And Laura, if you have any suggestions of someone else you'd like to bring in, please let me know as well. Okay?
Will do.
And thank you very much. I'm going to stop recording now, if I can find the button there.